Hey everybody, it's Jared from Young Minds and Big Questions. Thanks for checking out the video. We just want you to know if you want to hear more content, you can find us on iTunes and SoundCloud. So give us a like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Peace.
Welcome to Young Minds and Big Questions. Today on the podcast, we're talking genocide, slavery, and the problem of evil in the Old Testament with special guest Dr. Paul Copan. Check it out. Welcome to Young Minds and Big Questions, everybody. My name is Jared, here with Anthony, and today we're super excited.
Very excited.
We have a special guest, a guy who we have watched on YouTube, read his books, hugely influenced by his work.
Yeah, definitely.
And now we have a chance to chat with him, which is really cool. Dr. Paul Copan is with us.
Thank you for coming on, Dr. Copan.
Yay, great to be with you guys.
All right. Well, for those of you who don't know who Paul Copan is, he is a philosopher, a theologian, an apologist, an author, currently a professor at Palm Beach Atlantic University, written and edited over 25 different books in the areas of philosophy of religion, apologetics, theology, science and religion, and the historicity of Christ himself. He served for 6 years as the president of the Evangelical Philosophical Society. So great to have Dr. Paul Copan with us. Tell us a little bit about your life, your journey. How'd you get to where you're at now?
Well, I grew up in a Christian home, but it really wasn't until high school where I started to see that there is a need to not only take stock in what my parents had talked about as they brought us up in the Christian faith, but also to process that in a way that I connected it to reality, that many of the things that I took for granted, in a sense, I just kind of assimilated my parents' faith without really owning it myself. And so it was during high school that I started to see that actually the Christian faith makes sense. It's true. It's rooted in reality. It's anchored in the way things are. It's anchored in history that Jesus really did rise from the dead and so forth. So that was during high school. It was a very momentous time for me to make that connection and to see that my faith rested on very strong foundations. And so through this recognition, I built on that in my undergraduate years. I have an undergraduate in biblical studies from Columbia International University. And then I went on to Trinity Seminary in Deerfield, Illinois, where I was planning on getting a Master of Divinity degree. And my brother Vic, who happens to teach at Palm Beach Atlantic University right now, where I'm teaching, which is a lot of fun, he was getting a Master of Divinity as well as a Master of Arts in New Testament. And I happened to take a philosophy class when I first went to Trinity Seminary as an elective and found it very valuable with my Professor Stuart Hackett. And he had been someone who, for some of you out there may not know, that Stuart Hackett was one who strongly influenced William Lane Craig. And so Stuart Hackett was teaching there, and so that class that I took was very instrumental. And my brother Vic said, why don't you get a Master of Arts in Philosophy along with your Master of Divinity degree? So I ended up getting 2 degrees during my master's years and found that to be very, very energizing, very, very exciting. And then I was on staff with a church in New York for 6.5 years and found that having a background in philosophy was very, very valuable, especially as I worked with university students. And then I went on from there to get a PhD. My wife actually said, what about getting a PhD? And so we ended up going to Marquette University, had 4 kids at the time. Our 5th one was born in Wisconsin. And so got a PhD, and while I was finishing up my PhD coursework, I had been in touch with Ravi Zacharias. I'd met him in New York, and so he had told me to consider coming on staff with him in the Atlanta area. And so I ended up working with this apologist, Ravi Zacharias, who's well recognized, and so I did speaking on university campuses as well as teaching at seminaries, and so was with Ravi for about 5 years, and then again speaking on apologetical themes and teaching in theology and philosophy and so forth, and then ended up coming down to Palm Beach Atlantic University in 2004. So that's a bit of the synopsis of my journey. But again, I found very valuable the study of philosophy. I found that it's a great door opener. I found that even as you get into apologetics, it's nice to have a philosophical background to deal with some of the underlying issues that often aren't addressed when you're simply dealing with issues in apologetics like the resurrection of Jesus or biblical reliability or something like that. So it was very valuable for me to have that breadth of background before coming down to say Palm Beach Atlantic University.
Man, that's cool. What a story. So you've obviously met Ravi Zacharias. Have you met William Lane Craig?
Well, as it turns out, when I was at Trinity Seminary, William Lane Craig was also one of my professors. So
oh my goodness!
So he was my professor there, and even after I was after I had graduated, and Bill Craig was then moving on to Europe to work there. He was a visiting professor visiting scholar in Belgium at the University of Louvain. And so I invited him when I was on staff of the church to come and do a series of debates in upstate New York. And so he ended up doing a debate with Peter Zoss, a New Testament scholar, a Jewish New Testament scholar, and that debate ended up turning into a book that I co-edited with Craig Evans called "Who is Jesus? A Jewish Christian Dialogue."
Oh,
and so I've worked with Bill Craig on several projects. So our friendship led to 3 co-edited books together. We're working on 2 more now on the Kalam Cosmological Argument with Bloomsbury Press. And we co-authored a book called Creation Out of Nothing. And then we've also edited books to which the other has contributed chapters. And so it's been a very wonderful relationship. We were serving in the Evangelical Philosophical Society together. I was vice president under Bill Craig's leadership as president in the EPS before I became president. And so it's been a wonderful working relationship we've had over the years.
Man, I mean, this is like a dream for some of us to have a dinner party with you, Ravi, Bill. I mean, what the conversation must be like around that table.
It's a lot of fun.
So me and Jared both do ministry in New York, and we see the value of understanding philosophy and understanding apologetics. In your experience, in your time in New York, how did philosophy help you engage with the culture and engage with people's questions?
Well, just a little bit of background. I was on staff with a church in New York, as I mentioned. I was in Schenectady, New York, so upstate New York. And while I was there, I was also asked to be a volunteer staff worker with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, a campus ministry. And so I gladly agreed and found that through my interaction with students, having a background in philosophy was so valuable. It just opened up conversations. There's a college nearby. It's called Union College. And there's a debating society that's there. It's called the Philomathian Society. I don't know if it still is going, but every semester or every trimester, I would go over to the Philomathian Society and I would speak on a particular topic, and then the students who are part of the debating society would have 2 minutes to offer a rebuttal to me, and then I would get up and offer a response to them.
Wow.
So it'd be a very energetic back and forth for about 45 minutes to an hour. And so we just had a great time. So it was like a significant engagement with university students through that forum. And I would bring people from my church who would come and listen and hear me interact, and they would interact with university students as well. And so it was just a terrific experience. And I just found that as you speak to people who have when they hear philosophy, they think, oh, this person must not be a believer or something.
Right,
There's often
right.
this association, oh, that person's into philosophy, must be an atheist or a
Yeah.
skeptic. And so for many of them, it was a surprise. Wow, this guy's got a background in philosophy, and he believes in God. He's a Christian. And they were just so stunned
Yeah.
by that. And so I found that it was just a great door opener, and I said, no, philosophy is not at all at odds with the Christian faith. In fact, philosophy is a tool that is very useful within the Christian faith. That God is the author of the human mind, and so He gives us the capacity to think deeply and hard about these important issues, and also to point out to people that even though there is this discipline called philosophy. And many people with different viewpoints, have been noted philosophers. It's also important to note that people have different worldviews, that every philosopher has a worldview or a philosophy of life. And
Yep.
so to point out that there is no default position here, that if you're an atheist, well, what are your reasons for being an atheist? That's not a self-justifying position. A lot of people think that, if you believe in God or you're, quote, religious, therefore you have some burden of proof. I say no. Everyone who has a worldview is going to some measure, have a burden of proof. Everyone believes certain things about reality. Everyone believes certain things about knowledge and whether we can or how we can attain it, and ethics and so forth. All of those things, that's part of philosophy. Everyone has a philosophy of life, and so the question is, how do you justify it? What are your reasons for it? How does your view warranted? How do you defend it in the marketplace of ideas? And so just challenging people to give reasons rather than just taking the default position against, say, a Christian viewpoint and saying, no, well, you believe that there is no God. That is a knowledge claim. How do you justify that sort of a claim? So it was very helpful to engage with skeptics, to challenge them according to their presuppositions and say, well, here, if you think that science is the only way to know something, how do you know that? That's not through the scientific method that you know that. That's a philosophical assumption. Or when people say, how can you be 100% certain that God exists? I'll say, well, why think that knowledge requires 100% certainty? And a lot of people will hold Christians often to a higher standard than they will their own belief system. And so sometimes pushing back and saying, hey, you're not being fair. Here you're insisting that I give you 100% certainty, and here you're saying, oh, it could have happened that way when it comes to your own beliefs. And I'm saying, no, let's play fair here. Let's hold each other to the same kinds of standards rather than having this double standard in which you let yourself off the hook pretty easily, and you're holding my feet to the fire pretty fiercely.
That's some good points.
And again, challenging people about the whole notion that knowledge requires 100% certainty, and I tell people, well, how do you know with 100% certainty that knowledge requires a 100% certainty?
Right.
Again, that's just going to be question-begging here, and we can talk about knowledge without having 100% certainty. So anyway, those are some of the things that would come up in conversations on the university campuses, and so it's good to be able to push back on some of these kind of cultural myths that a lot of people buy into.
That's great. Hopefully throughout this conversation, if there's those who are non-believers or skeptics, maybe they'll hear about God in a little bit different way and have some questions answered. One of the first ones we wanted to throw out at you is you've argued before that our morality comes from God, that our conscience is from Him, His law is written on our heart. And we want to know that sometimes when we read the Bible, there's certain things that seem to offend our morality that God says or does, and we feel like, wow, that seems wrong. So why is it that sometimes we seem more offended by God's actions in the Old Testament than He is?
Well, maybe at least in part because God is the cosmic moral authority, and we are also skewed in our thinking. We are sinners who don't always see things clearly. For example, we might be highly sensitized to racial issues, that we are in tune with bigotry and racism and prejudice and so forth. And, well, maybe so, but maybe we're not as attuned to, say, sexual morality as we should be. So we kind of give ourselves a pass on sexual morality and think about, a lot of people just take for granted sexual freedom and so forth, that this is the enlightened view. Well, if you take that view, God's view on sexual morality is going to seem harsh. It's going to seem that it doesn't give us freedom and so forth. Well, whereas it's actually, when you walk in the ways of God, that kind of freedom to live as we ought, it all becomes very clear that God's way makes sense. So again, there are a couple of factors that we need to keep in mind. One, God is a moral authority. Two, we're also sinners who are skewed by our own culture, by our own sinfulness and so forth, and we can become subject to our own self-deception and live in light of what is actually out of tune with the moral realm. But let me also add that it doesn't mean that all of our concerns or problems go away given that realization. There are some things that are startling in Scripture that even biblical authorities, biblical authors like the psalmists or some of the prophets who are wondering, why doesn't God do something? Why is God seemingly slow to act? Why do the evildoers prosper? Why is God not stepping in and bringing justice and so forth? Or isn't God being too harsh with those people like Uzzah, who's touching the ark to steady it? Of course, even though the rules were broken in the first place when they were transporting the ark in the wrong way. But be that as it may, there are those sorts of concerns that people raise, that God seems to be harsh, God seems to be maybe overly oppressive, that the laws of the Old Testament are just too over the top when it comes to severity and so on. Well, there are some genuine questions that we ought to be asking, and that's why I've done a book like Is God a Moral Monster? Or Did God Really Command Genocide? Because when you look at some of these texts, you say, okay, well, there's something harsh seems to be going on here. How do I make sense of it? And I'd say, too, that as we look at some of these texts more closely, there are a lot of misunderstandings that often revolve around these texts, and a lot of people, for example, will look at leave alive nothing that breathes, or there were we left no survivor, and so forth. Well, then you have this question: well, if the command is to leave alive nothing that breathes, show them no mercy, and so forth, and then you have somebody like Joshua doing everything that Moses commanded, and yet he leaves lots of survivors. What's going on here? And so a lot of people want to take literally, as it were, the command to utterly destroy and leave alive nothing that breathes, but they don't take literally the fact that there are lots of survivors who have allegedly been utterly destroyed or annihilated. Right. So what's going on here? Well, it requires a bit more homework here, and you realize that things are much more nuanced and textured than we realize. And so understanding a little bit of the background to these war texts, that there is exaggeration or hyperbole, those sorts of things could also be helpful as we come to terms with, well, what's actually going on in these texts. So again, there could be a number of factors, and again, I don't know how far you want to probe into this, but again, those moral intuitions that we have, yes, there are some offsetting factors. God is the cosmic authority. Secondly, the question of our own sinfulness and jadedness, even to holy God standards, and then also just understanding what the text is actually saying. Are we actually reading it properly? And what I tell people is, you're not reading it closely enough. You need to actually dig in more deeply rather than giving this kind of superficial read and thinking, oh, look at what this God is doing. No, there's more nuance in this text than you realize.
So, keeping in this vein, Richard Dawkins wrote in The God Delusion that the Bible story of Joshua's destruction of Jericho and the invasion of the Promised Land in general is morally indistinguishable from Hitler's invasion of Poland or Saddam Hussein's massacre of the Kurds. The Bible may be an arresting and poetic work of fiction, but it is not the sort of book you should give to your children to form their morals. So, Dr. Copan, Is Joshua's invasion of Jericho morally indistinguishable from Hitler's invasion of Poland? Are those two things morally and ethically comparable?
Well, just back up a little bit. Maybe we shouldn't give Richard Dawkins' works to our children, because he says, in a world of selfish genes and electrons, there is no good or evil.
Right.
Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So, what's he talking about? I want to know.
Yeah.
Is there no good or evil? Then why is he getting upset with the God of the Old Testament? There is no good or evil. So given naturalism, how do you come to that kind of a moral judgment? What is the basis on which you even offer some sort of moral criticism? It's really hypocritical. But back to the question: is the invasion of Jericho nothing more than what, say, Hitler did? Well, did Hitler, when he went into Poland, was he invading a people characterized by incest, bestiality, infant sacrifice, ritual prostitution, acts that would be considered criminal acts in any civilized society? Was that Poland? No, that was Canaan. Also, did Hitler give a lot of warning to people, like, maybe 500 years, when God tells Abraham that he's going to wait till the sin of the Amorites is completed? And even as the time's approaching when the Israelites are in Egypt and God is doing signs and wonders, the Canaanites heard about it. They all knew what this God of the Israelites had done in Egypt. And Rahab said, "We know what your God has done." The Amorite king, or the Canaanite kings in Joshua 5, they're talking about this God who has led the Israelites through the Jordan, and the Gibeonites in Joshua chapter 9, they know what God did in Egypt, and also the Philistines in 1 Samuel 4, they knew what God had done to the gods of the Egyptians and so forth. Folks, there's plenty of warning here too. There's fair warning. Furthermore, you also have this God who is acting not through mere revelation to Joshua, that God has somehow spoken into Joshua's ear and he says, "Oh, God told me to invade the Canaanite peoples." No, God is these commands that are being given are accompanied by very public signs and wonders. Everyone knew what was going on. The Egyptians knew it. There's manna, in the wilderness every morning. There was a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. So, did Hitler have that kind of those signs and wonders and so forth? Was this sort of in the backdrop here? Of course not. You find all sorts of the parallels are just not there. There is a great disparity here, and what Richard Dawkins is saying, and again, I could go on in the book, Is God a Moral Monster, or did God really command genocide? Goes into a lot more details comparing these sorts of things. You have all manner of differences here, but that's just a start.
Dr. Copan, with that, when I've talked about this issue with some people, it seems interesting to me that I've always kind of made the point that anytime we see God's judgment and wrath, it's always actually a sign of His grace and His evangelism in a sense. And the connection I made, and I'm interested in your thoughts because maybe I'm totally off here, but the connection I made is in that culture. I think in your book you talk about how they were polytheists, and their belief in the validity of their gods was often connected to their military victory or military prowess. So in order to get them to understand that their theology is wrong, the main way you'd have to do that is to defeat them militarily. Is that a fair and true assumption?
Yeah, I think maybe even to expand it a little bit, think of a triangle. At the top, you have the deity, whether it be God or Baal or something like that. And then at the bottom two corners, you have the land and the people. And there is a kind of nexus between the God and the land and the people, such that if you drove out the people, it was actually an indication of not just military superiority, but actually a spiritual superiority, a spiritual power that was greater than another. And so to drive, say, the Canaanites out of the land was actually a kind of unsettling thing, because it actually totally messed up this kind of nexus of the God and the land and the people. That if another people is driving out the people who are connected to the land and to their deity of that land, then this is a kind of religious or theological instability that is created, that is kind of a shattering of the worldview. So it's really in some ways a kind of a spiritual warfare matter as well. So yeah, there are a number of background issues here that help to bring greater illumination to what is actually going on here. That it's, well, for one thing, it's not just one nation invading another. We're talking about the God who is the creator of the universe, who is bringing judgment upon the Canaanites by driving them out and using the Israelites to drive them out, and also displacing them, but displacing the Canaanites and giving the land to the Israelites, which he has promised, but not until the time is right. The time has to be right for the Israelites to come in, and before the sin of the Canaanites had ripened, it would not have been appropriate for the Israelites to come in.
Would you say that there's also opportunity, I think you kind of mentioned this, there's also opportunity for these cultures and people to respond to the revelation of Yahweh to them, and we do see examples of that happening. You mentioned Rahab as one of them.
Yeah, you do. Exactly. Rahab is an example. Also at the end of Joshua chapter 8, you have these strangers who are mentioned, the very last verses of Joshua chapter 8, who are part of a covenant renewal ceremony with the Israelites. And this is between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, which is the town of Shechem. So you have these people, these Shechemites, these Canaanites, who are there on site and participating in this covenant renewal ceremony. So you do have a God who is not, tribalistic,
right,
that he's not opposed to the Canaanites. In fact, when you have God telling Abraham in Genesis 15 that he's going to that he's going to give Abraham's descendants the land of the the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hittites, the Kenizzites, the Kenites, the Hittites, etc. Well, you look at these people. I mean, most of them, like you think of Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite. Well, that's the same people that we're talking about. Here Caleb comes into the promised land, but his roots were there. His father's heritage was that of the Kenizzite people. You have Moses' father-in-law, who is called, who's a Midianite. Again, those are the Kenite people. You have the mention of the Hittites. Well, Uriah the Hittite was one of David's mighty men. You have again all of these peoples. Again, it's not as though there's some sort of racial or tribal animosity. No, it's very much a moral and theological matter that the people who are being judged are engaging in all sorts of horrific actions and therefore are to be judged. But again, it's not by virtue of any sort of ethnic or tribal reason.
Yeah, that's super, super helpful. A lot of times when we're reading these passages that seem to be so morally problematic in the Old Testament, those moral concerns start to dissipate when you understand the cultural context and the milieu in which they were written. And that's very important when you're looking at these just at face value. You don't get the context and the background you need to fully understand them. So that's why we very much appreciate the work that you do. Sam Harris says that the abolitionists were on the losing side of a theological battle. What do you do, Dr. Copan? What do you do with passages that seem to suggest that the Bible is approving of slavery?
Well, of course, if you're assuming that when you're talking about slavery, you're meaning the antebellum South or something like that, well, of course, that's an unfortunate association that is being made. So, and I think that a lot of the Bible translations today have this kind of, kind of a freedom to just translate the term eved, slave, as slave, rather than nuancing it a bit more. That what we're dealing with is often, say, indentured servitude, where you are a free citizen, but if you want to, say, get passage, like as it was in colonial America, you want to get passage to the New World, then you would have to work for someone for, say, 7 years, and then once your debt was paid off, then you were free to go about your business. You didn't have any sort of inherent stigma attached to you. Whereas in Scripture, you have in the Old Testament, you have the Israelites who have again, not anything like this terrible scourge of antebellum type slavery, but rather this is something that is contractual. It's voluntarily entered into when you're impoverished, and it is limited to a certain period of time unless you want to attach yourself to a household. So it was possible to say, I love the person for whom I'm working, and so you could say live in that person's house permanently. So it suggests that you could be in this kind of a condition in Israel where it's actually quite favorable, where it was not something oppressive and harsh and ruthless and brutal and so forth. In fact, when you look at the legislation of the Mosaic Law, you see that those who were foreigners who ran away as slaves from their masters, they were not to be sent back to their master, but they were allowed to settle in any of Israel's cities. So you see, Israel is actually a place of refuge for people who are suffering from oppression, from the harshness of a taskmaster, perhaps like the antebellum South. But Israel was supposed to be different. It was supposed to be a refuge from there. So this is, and also, the reason people were in servitude was because of their poverty. And if you could help people in their poverty and alleviate it by gleaning laws or by having them, giving them breaks where they don't have to pay for expensive sacrificial animals, or where you wouldn't charge them interest and so forth. There were laws to keep people from being put under the scourge of poverty and having to sell themselves into servitude. There were controls to help diminish that blow, and also the land reverting back to the original tribal owner, who might have to lease his land when he was impoverished. But again, so you have these measures to try to keep people out of poverty. And even with foreigners, you'd have law, like in Leviticus 25, when people say, look, you can acquire slaves, you can acquire them and they could serve you perpetually, you can pass them on to your children. Well, for one thing, we use the language of acquiring when we talk about basketball players or baseball players being acquired and so forth. So it doesn't mean that people are just property or something like that. Also, keep this in mind that when people when these foreigners are coming, these strangers and sojourners in Israel, they can actually become persons of means. That the foreigner whom the Israelites can acquire to live in households. Well, remember this too, those foreigners can't actually acquire land. It's only the Israelites who can have land. So really the best way to kind of establish yourself in Israel is to attach yourself to a household. And again, your own children would continue on in that household. So rather than thinking of this in terms of oppression, we actually should think of this in terms of actually kind of a safety net, as a kind of a security. And also those people who can become persons of means, those sojourners and aliens, they can actually enter into the position of actually being able to take on an Israelite servant. So just as the Israelites can have foreign servants, so the foreigners can have Israelite servants in Israel too. So it's kind of interesting how that works. A lot of people don't want to read as far into that text, in Leviticus 25 to verse 47, where actually those people who are actually in servitude can become persons of means, so that they could even have an Israelite working for them. Very interesting.
Wow, that is super interesting. It's not at all about race, but more about economics and actually kind of a cushion and a safety net economically for people.
Exactly. And I think, too, we need to remember that even though you have the Mosaic Law, where you will have certain provisional things, certain things that are less than ideal given the situation on the ground, we need to distinguish between some of those laws and the greater vision that the Old Testament has, where human beings are made in the image of God, where there is a fundamental equality. Even Job, in Job chapter 30, articulates this vision when he says that both he and his own servants came from the same place, namely their mother's womb. So he recognizes that there is no fundamental intrinsic difference between them. Indeed, that's part of what sets Israel apart from other ancient civilizations. That, for example, Plato and Aristotle believed that slaves were born that way. They were slaves by nature, and that they could not, by definition, therefore, have any capacity to rule over people, because that was just what they were by nature, by birth. They were slaves, and you couldn't change that. That's just the way things are. Again, very far from the biblical vision, where you have a fundamental equality that is built in from the very beginning. Even if things may fall into sin and degradation and people taking advantage of others, there is still that overarching biblical vision that you see being highlighted.
In preparation for this, we kind of asked for some questions, and one of the questions that we've heard come in is about the passage in Numbers 31:17 through 18. And it says, "Now kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourself every girl who has never slept with a man." And the question was about that passage and the fact that it seems very much like almost sexual slavery, or kind of this reward for conquering a land, something we see all throughout history, but something that would surprise to see from God's people and a command from God himself. So do you have any kind of thoughts or helpful things for us about that passage in particular?
Yeah, sure. Some people have said, oh, look, this is a passage that endorses rape. Well, no, in the book of Deuteronomy, we read very clearly that there's a certain protocol to follow. Rape outside of rape was wrong, and any sort of sexual activity outside of marriage was prohibited. I mean, that's just fundamental. And so if there were, for example, foreign women who were to participate in Israel's life, say, this is kind of a safety net for them too, but they would have to go through a mourning ceremony, basically that is shave their heads, clip their nails, and it was to be a month of waiting before any sort of marriage could be entered into. It wasn't as though, hey, look at this, there's this foreign woman, just take her and rape her, use her, and so forth. No, there was a proper protocol that was to be followed, and indeed, this woman was to be honored. So there was not it was not just a simple, hey, let's just grab them and no, there was a way of dealing with those women who had been involved in this warfare sort of setting. Now let's go back to Numbers 31, where you have, it's interesting that it's actually Moses who is giving a command, but we're told that what the suggestion is it's actually going beyond what God himself has said. God, we're told in the early portion of Numbers 31, basically to kill the men. And so we're told that the Israelites indeed carried that out, that they killed the men, the Midianite males, the adult males, and then so they've done their job, and then Moses says, kill the women too who have slept with men and so forth. Of course, this is in the context of, remember, Numbers 25, where there had been this incident at Baal Peor, where there were women involved in trying to seduce the Israelites, because this is a ploy that the false prophet Balaam had encouraged the king, of Moab to engage in this seduction, because God wouldn't allow Balaam to curse the Israelites, and so he basically, through a subterfuge, found a way that the Israelites could act treacherously or treasonously against God and bring judgment upon them, so that the Moabites could have the upper hand. So this was, again, part of a strategy. So there is a judgment that is indeed there. But what's interesting is that Moses actually seems to be going beyond what the Lord had already commanded. So and actually nothing ends up happening. And furthermore, even if we just take these texts, these war texts that we are often reading, when it says that they killed all the men, it's interesting that you keep reading when you get to the book of Judges, all of the Midianites. It seems like they are very much, in abundance. That the Midianites were too numerous to count. We read in Judges 6:5 that even their camels were too numerous to count. Well, where do they all come from if they've all been basically wiped out? So there does seem to be some sort of I would argue, Moses going beyond what the Lord had told him to do, because the Israelite soldiers had actually completed their task. Some people say, well, isn't he a prophet? Isn't he always to be listened to? Well, yeah, generally speaking, but it's also possible for prophets in their zeal to go beyond what God has actually commanded. So think of David when he wants to build a temple. Well, Nathan the prophet says, yes, the Lord is with you. Go and build. Well, then the Lord appears to Nathan in the night and says, nope, David is not going to build. It's actually going to be Solomon who's going to be building. Basically, he's being premature in his blessing. And so he has to later retract that and say, no, it's going to be Solomon who builds the temple. So, again, you have that sort of scenario where that sort of thing is possible. Anyway, that's how I would respond to it. I would just simply point people to the fuller discussion in the book, Did God Really Command Genocide, for more details on that.
We have to understand the distinction between prescriptive verses and descriptive verses. Just because the Bible is describing a specific event in history does not mean that God approves of what's going on morally. So I appreciate that point, Dr. Copan.
Thanks.
One of the main critiques that I hear from unbelievers about the Old Testament is the flood story. After reading the story, a lot of people feel a sense of moral outrage. Presumably there's innocent children that are dying in this flood. How could you justify this morally? Also, I think a lot of listeners would be interested to know, myself included, whether you believe in a local flood or a global flood.
Okay, a few questions there. All right. In terms of the universality of the flood, it does seem that we do have a flood that does cover the sweep of humanity. But on the other hand, I would say we have reason for looking at this text itself and saying, well, it's probably more like a regional flood that affects all people rather than it being something that is inundates the whole globe. One reason, just kind of immediate in the text in Genesis chapter 2, you have the mention of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Well, if it's a global flood, you'd think that the Tigris and Euphrates rivers would be silted over and that they wouldn't exist anymore. But sure enough, in Genesis 15, we read about the Euphrates River, after the flood, and so forth. Wow. So it seems like we've got something more regional going on here than a global deluge. And we can just talk about how even in the when the term Earth, ha'aretz, is used in Genesis, it can also be translated land, which, for example, in Genesis chapter 11, it says the whole, again, ha'aretz, the whole land spoke one language, and then it says they moved eastward to the plain of Shinar. Well, if you're talking about the whole earth, it would be strange for them to all move eastward. But if you're talking about the land, say, of Canaan, and everybody moves eastward, then that makes a bit more sense. There's kind of a migration eastward. And indeed, in the book of Genesis, you do have this kind of literary device where to go east is to go away from what appears to be the blessing of God. To go westward, like Abraham did, or Abram did, is to go away from that negativity and into the blessing of God. Lot looks eastward towards Sodom. Cain goes east of Eden to the land of Nod. Adam and Eve go eastward, and so forth. So there is that, I think, linguistic connection too. So when we talk about all the hills being covered and so forth, well, they can be covered as far as Noah sees them, but basically keeping it regional. But more to the point now of the moral consideration. How could God command this? Well, one, God is the one who's actually the author of life, and if he takes life in judgment, then that is his prerogative. God is not under some sort of a law that he's obligated to give maybe 70 or 80 years of life to people. No, God is the one who gives life. He takes life, and if He has morally sufficient reasons for bringing judgment. Again, remember the people have not been listening to Noah. There's been resistance. It's sort of like the last resort, and it's sort of like God having to begin creation all anew, because there just is no repentance, there is no remorse, and so God just has to say, okay, I've got to start over here. And so God brings judgment, and then you have the language of a new creation, where you have just as the Spirit hovered over the waters, in Genesis 1, you have now the dove and the hovering over the waters. You have the the mandate once again to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. You have, in a sense, kind of a new life that is being given. And then you have this man who's walked with God, this man who has been blameless, Noah, who then engages in a second fall, where you have him eating the fruit, and there's sin that comes as a result of that in a kind of a garden or vineyard setting, and then there is nakedness, there is a curse, there is that sort of a thing. So you have kind of a parallel to what's going on in the early chapters of Genesis. So again, there is a theological picture here too that is being presented, that God is beginning a kind of new creation, as it were, and starting over again, and seeking to bring about redemption through this this new work that He is going to be doing, because the people to whom Noah was preaching refused to listen. There was a hardness of heart, and so God says, "I've got to start over."
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and people have a hard time
swallowing that.
Well, I think for a lot of people, they want to hold God to a standard that they don't hold themselves to, and so everybody believes in justice, but for some reason, when God enacts justice, it's somehow unfair or unpalatable. So I think that's a good point, which actually leads us, kind of segues into our next question that we had, which is about the problem of evil, and this is. Doing apologetics with young adults, this is probably one of the biggest issues we see, or one of the roadblocks that we see for people putting their faith in God, is because they just look at evil in the world, or they have some sort of a situation that they've gone through and they can't reconcile. How could a good God allow this kind of stuff? You do a lot of apologetics, Dr. Copan. How do you wrestle through the problem of evil and belief in God?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult topic, to be sure. I just today met with a student of mine who, just a fine young Christian woman, and she, in her own story, has, her own brother had been just shot. He was walking home from work, and someone drove by and shot him.
Wow. And
again, this didn't happen recently, but again, that was part of her own family story, and so very difficult, painful, and really emotionally shattering experience. But I would say a few things that would be helpful to keep in mind, and one is this: everyone has to deal with the problem of evil. It's not just a Christian problem. Where did people get that idea that it's just theists that have this problem to deal with, that Christians alone have this burden of proof or something? No, everyone has to deal with the problem of evil. My question is, which worldview has the best resources to make sense out of the problem of evil? Which gives us the best resources to actually grapple with and even come to a better understanding of the problem of evil, helping us to live in an evil world? Which worldview does that? I mean, is it naturalism, which basically says, like Richard Dawkins, in a world of selfish genes and electrons, there is no good or evil, just denying it? Or what about Eastern philosophies, some of which deny the existence of evil? They deny good or evil at all. And so I'd say those are deeply problematic worldviews. Those are non-starters. If they're denying something so fundamental as the reality of evil, then there's something that we can say, well, automatic rejection here. This is failing to account for something that is so obvious, so pervasive. In fact, atheists themselves will use the problem of evil against God's existence, but that leaves us with yet another question. Not only is the problem of evil something that all worldviews have to grapple with. But the naturalist or the atheist has two problems to deal with, not only the problem of evil, but also the problem of goodness. How do you judge something to be evil unless you have some sort of a standard, some sort of a measure, some sort of a design plan? Because evil, after all, is a departure from the way things ought to be. But if things ought to be different than the way that they are, then you're left with this question, where did that standard come from? You see, the atheist does not have any basis for grounding that kind of a standard. Nature is all that there is. Mm-hmm. If there are things that we don't like, too bad. That's just the way things are. But if you get rid of God, you're getting rid of any sort of design plan. You're getting rid of the very potential for coming to terms with the problem of evil. You're getting rid of both. You're getting rid of the very standard that will help us maybe figure out a bit more about how to grapple with the problem of evil in the first place. So if you get rid of God, it only makes matters worse. Thirdly, I would say that when it comes to the problem of evil, God has actually done something about evil. That, for one thing, if there is no God, there will be no cosmic justice. Think about it. If Hitler, Stalin, and Pol Pot engaged in such barbarous and murderous acts in a godless world, then they have gotten away with murder, with terrible evils. There will be no justice done. That's just the way it is. And people who have lived virtuous lives, serving others and so forth, there will be no, maybe many of them doing this quietly, in secret. Again, no recognition. Maybe some of them are actually put in prison because they've done the courageous and right thing. But if there is no final judgment, if there is no reckoning, no giving to every person according to his deeds, then you don't have justice done. Naturalism cannot guarantee that cosmic justice will be done. Whereas if God exists, cosmic justice is guaranteed. God will reward everyone according to his works. Furthermore, we can say this, that God has actually stepped into this world, this evil world, has faced evil and injustice, has come to face death itself, to die naked on a cross of shame and humiliation at the hands of people who committed murder, who destroyed an innocent life. Here you have a picture of self-sacrificing love, facing evil in order to overcome evil, so that there will be a new creation that comes in which there will be no evil. Evil will be quarantined. There will be justice that is done. That there is a happily ever after scenario that we can look forward to. That is what comes with the existence of God in the biblical tradition. That this is an actual addressing, a resolution, as it were, to the problem of evil. So even if we can't figure out why this or that evil, we can see that when you look at the big picture, we say, no, it actually, if God exists, things make sense. If you get rid of God, things don't make sense. If you don't have God, there will be no cosmic justice. And in order to help us to address the problem of evil in our very lives, we have a God who steps into this world to identify with us in this world of evil and suffering. I'd say that's a much better looking picture, intellectually as well as emotionally, than what you have on the naturalistic side of things.
Wow, that was a beautiful response, Dr. Copan. I want to switch gears a little bit. Many theologians argue that presuppositional apologetics is the only biblically consistent way to do apologetics. James White, for example, makes this point all the time. I personally was just wondering what your thoughts are on the differing apologetic methodologies.
Well, I would say that even the way that we engage in the use of, say, laws of logic and so forth, it's kind of interesting that people who will typically engage in presuppositional apologetics, which is often dismissing, say, theistic arguments for God's existence, like the teleological or cosmological arguments, they will still appeal to some sort of a transcendental argument for God's existence, arguing that you cannot even have rational thought, and I think that there's something to it, that even the capacity for rationality must be rooted in God. Well, isn't that an argument for God's existence? How does that really differ from the moral argument or the teleological argument and so forth? So I would say that there are some problems here, and also it's not as though the presuppositionalist doesn't have something legitimate to say about the embeddedness of worldviews, that ultimately a worldview is a commitment of the heart. But no one's denying the embeddedness of worldviews. But again, I would say that that we need to remember that on the one hand, presuppositionalism isn't fully satisfactory. Just as on the other hand, evidentialism is not fully satisfactory. That just to give people evidence, saying, kind of stacking up all the evidence and saying, kind of wake up and see all the reasons, therefore you should be a Christian based on all of this information that I'm giving you. That's not how it works either. And so I think that there's going to be something more in the middle, in which we recognize, on the one hand, yes, the embeddedness of of these worldviews, these commitments of the heart, but on the other hand, that of course God can break through and use reason. He can use arguments for God's existence, as many of us in engaging in this area have seen take place. And also that there is, on the other hand, that you see strong evidences that are being given, offered as, again, not knock down, drag out proofs or something like that, but strong reasons for taking, say, the existence of God seriously. So again, I would say that there's something we can learn from different apologetical camps, and so I don't want to dismiss out of hand all that presuppositionalism is saying, but I think that there are some things that from which we can benefit as we look at each of these differing apologetical approaches or approaches to this whole issue of what stance should I take when it comes to apologetics. So again, those are just a few thoughts, but I should leave it there.
Okay.
That's great, man. This has been awesome, and as we wrap up, I think the most important question that everyone's dying to know is, what is your favorite pizza toppings?
Favorite pizza topping, sausage.
Okay.
So, wow, that's out of left field, and I am with you on that. That is delicious. Well, Dr. Copan, thank you so much. This has been great. I could sit here personally and for hours and I'd love to hear about your thoughts on soteriology, eschatology, and a whole bunch of other issues. But we'll save that maybe for another time, and maybe one day we'll get to be a part of that secret dinner party. Okay,
at which we'll have pizza, right, with sausage on it, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll bring that for you.
Just topping.
You lived in upstate New York, so you know how we roll down here. We'll bring the pizza.
All right, sounds good. Well, guys, pizza be unto you.
Thank you so much, and good luck to you and your busy schedule and all that you've got going on with teaching.
Thank you for all you do. We'll be praying for you.
Appreciate that. Thank you very kindly.
All right.
Have a good one.
Good to be with you. Bye, guys.